Welcome back, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for episode 5 of the watercolor series. In this episode, we will be painting a little robin perched on a white picket fence. I got my watercolor paper all taped down. I have my reference material ready. I've taken the time to pre-draw what we're going to be painting, so we are pretty much ready to go. We'll be using the basic techniques that we've learned, as well as the same palette that we've been working with. We are going to be looking at how to do dry brushing when we get ready to do the picket fence. Remember that this is a series about painting with watercolors, so if you need a little help with your drawing, go ahead and check out my drawing technique series. Okay, so now that we have everything ready, let's go ahead and get started. Now that we got the drawing all done and we are ready to go, let's talk a little bit about the prep. So I decided to go with the little robin for this right here, and I've already sketched it out, and there's only a few little areas where I need to put in some frisket just to protect some bright areas, so I'm going to do that in a minute. And then instead of doing this gray fence right here, I think I want to make it a white picket fence, just show more contrast. So to do that, I'm just going to protect a little bit of the top right here with the frisket as well, and then we'll be ready to get started. Okay, so we've given the frisket a little time to dry, and we're pretty much ready to start painting. I have my palette over here, my water, paper towels, etc. Before we start painting though, let me kind of walk you through what I'm planning on. And again, watercolor is relatively easy if you take a few minutes to plan ahead. So for the background, I'm just going to keep it very loose, kind of like a vignette. I'm not going to use these exact same colors, but it'll be something similar, right? And I'm not going to put any of these little details because I just want it to fade away. When I start working on the chest, I'm going to change it up a little bit. I want these areas to look even brighter, so I'm going to add a little bit more yellow to the brown to make it more like a golden color. And then down here, there's going to be a shadow, so the light source is probably coming from up here. Because this part has a lot of gray in it, and we need brown to make gray, I don't have to be too careful when I paint the stomach. If I get a little brown on here, it doesn't matter because we need brown to make gray. And then for the picket fence, I'm going to go with a white picket fence, but I don't want it pure white. I want it to be a little bit distressed, and I'm thinking that I'm going to use like a purplish color for the shadows rather than a gray. Gray to me always seems like a very, very dull color. So I'm going to make a lot of changes here as we go along. Alright, so I'm going to start with the background, and all I'm going to do is mix up a little green and a little violet, and then just kind of let them mix together. And then we'll move on to the bird. So first thing I'm going to do is come in here with some clean water, and I want to wet the entire area. Let that soak in a little bit, and while it's soaking in, I'm going to go ahead and mix up, put it here so you guys can see it. All I'm going to do is grab a little bit of yellow, clean brush, and a little bit of the phthalo blue. Mix up a nice green color. Doesn't have to be a true green. Then I'm going to take some of the crimson, put it over here, and use a little bit of the ultramarine blue, and that'll give me a violet. Alright, that looks like that the water's soaking in pretty nice. There is a little bit of a dry area here, so I'm just going to add a little bit of water right there. And then we can get started. So I want to keep this nice and loose. So I'm just going to start dropping in some of this green, throw in a little bit of that purplish color here and there. And I'm just going to create a really nice soft background. So, and after this dries and after I do the bird, if I feel like I need to go back and add some more, I will. But for right now, I just want to kind of change the background so that I can see what the actual contrast is going to be when I start working on the bird. Alright, so the background is done, it's dry, it's very soft, just a gentle color. And now I can start working on the bird. So what I'm going to do for the bird, this one actually is pretty straightforward, pretty easy. So take a little bit of clean water over here, grab a little yellow, cadmium yellow. I'm going to clean my brush. And then I'm going to reach over here and grab some of the burnt sienna. And by mixing it with the yellow, you get this golden color. You can even throw a little bit of orange in there, depending on what you want your bird to look like. And before I do that, I'm also going to mix up a little bit more of the purple. Just going to be over here. And I've mentioned in previous videos that I like to mix as I go, but if you prefer to pre-mix your colors, you can pre-mix them in these little containers here. Alright, so I'm going to switch over to the 1/2" brush, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and block this whole area in. And like I mentioned, if I get a little bit on the feathers, right on the wing, doesn't matter because that's going to be darker than the chest. So I'm going to reach in here and I'm going to wet this area just a little bit. Keep in mind that I've already dried the paper, so when I wet it, I'm only wetting the area that I want. Then I'm going to reach in here and I add just a little extra yellow right here. Clean my brush and then start working with the mixture here, the mixture that I made. And I'm actually going to allow the water, the wet paper, to do some of the mixing for me. As I start to come down towards the shadow area, which is going to be down here, I'm adding in pure sienna right here, just pure sienna. So it's a transition. And those little things that are happening, I actually want to allow that to happen. I want it to look like the suggestion of those feathers. Then I'm going to come down just a little bit more here. And then while that's wet, I'm going to go ahead and put in just a little bit of this violet color. The violet color will mix in with that brownish color and it will give you some very, very nice shadows. I'm just going to take this little brush without adding anything to it, and I'm just going to like move the paint to create like a little broken edge right here near my pencil line. Next thing to do is to block in the back of the bird, which has a lot of gray in it, so I'm just going to put that there. And the way that we mix up gray, if you remember, is we take a little bit of the sienna, the burnt sienna, and add just a little bit of the ultramarine blue and mix it thoroughly. So it gives you, it's kind of like a Payne's gray. And I like to start with the lighter one and then just build up those shadows a little bit at a time. So I'm going to reach in here And I know that the head looks almost black, but I don't want to start with black. So I'm just going to go here and using my number 2, start blocking that in. The top of the beak also, but not the bottom. The bottom has like a golden color to it. Remember to keep this light enough where you can still see your pencil drawing underneath, because we're going to come back in and we'll have to add some details, and we'll have to add some shadows to break up the, basically to separate the feathers. So in this case, I did not have to wet the paper first, because all I'm doing is putting in an underpainting really. So there's no mix in here. I do leave little pockets of white showing, so, but they're not planned, so don't be overly concerned if you fill yours in completely. And I ran out, so I'll just mix a little bit more sienna. And again, don't panic if it doesn't match perfectly. Actually, I'm not going to do that part yet because I got to take the brisket off. So I'm going to get in here and just kind of start putting this in a little bit more. And it's got a little bit on this side of the beak. And just kind of let it go into the... Alright, so I got most of the bird blocked in, and now I'm going to go ahead and block in the fence. Now before I block it in, I'm just going to fine tune the drawing just a little bit, because when you take the frisket off, often it takes some of the pencil lines off as well. I want this picket fence to look kind of beat up or distressed. So I don't want it to be, that's why I'm not using a ruler, because I don't want it to look like it's a brand new fence. I want it to look like it's been around a little bit. Okay, so I said that the light source was going to come this way. That means these areas of the fence are going to be a little bit darker, and also as the fence goes down, it's going to be darker. In theory, the tops of the fence are going to be the lightest area. So when I do the light area, since I don't want to paint white on it, what I may have to do is darken up the background just a little bit, just to create more contrast. But let's take a look and see what that looks like. So what I'm going to do, I'm actually going to mix up more of the purple color. So that's the crimson. Just do it over here so you can see more of the crimson and the ultramarine blue. And then I'm going to mix up a little bit of gray, which is burnt sienna, and the ultramarine blue. There we go. And I'm not going to pre-mix them. I'm going to mix it as I go. So what I want to do is I'm going to switch to my number 2. Excuse me. I'm going to switch to my 1/2-inch brush. And I'm going to go ahead and block in the shadows. And I'm just going to use the width of the brush to kind of help me with the shape of the fence. So I'm just going back and forth between the two. And as I go up towards the light source, it does need to get a little lighter. Alright, the next step, now that we have the plank separated, the next step is to do a little dry brushing. So I'm going to take my 1/2-inch brush And I'm going to load the sides, wipe off the extra, and then I'm just going to kind of like, I'm going to skim the surface, and I'm going to be kind of like shaky, touch, and then just kind of like, as I come down, I'm just going to suggest a little bit of texture on this wood. Now you don't want to make this too dark, so be careful with it. But all I'm doing is suggesting textures, and then I can also put in a little bit more of the vertical lines that you often see on the grain of the wood, but because it's painted you won't see it as much. So really I just want to create some really soft textures. Don't worry, as you can see there, that there are other colors in here. Okay? If this is distressed, you're going to see some of the colors from previous paint jobs. So that's one of the reasons that I don't really worry about it. I want to just suggest some textures. I want a lot of the white to show up, a lot of it. Okay, because overall we want the fence to feel like it's a white picket fence. We just don't want it to look brand new. Make sure, like there's too much water in the brush, so make sure that it's a dry brush. And back here it doesn't matter as much because I'm going to fade it anyways, but that was a pretty good example of what not to do. Same thing over here. I'm just going to fade it away, so there's not going to be a whole lot there. Alright, and then if you want to suggest like some of the texture of the wood, the grain of the wood, you can still use your 1/2 inch brush, and I'm just going to do a little bit. I'm just going to use my brush to suggest some vertical lines. Now notice I'm not doing this because these lines are rough, so I just want to like suggest the textures. If you want to put like a little knot in there, you can do it, or you can do it with a round brush, but just enough to indicate that there's texture, the grain of the wood. Alright, and then I'm going to make sure that this top edge is a little bit cleaner. It looks a little bit too jagged, so I'm going to use the same technique. The one thing I got to be careful with is I don't want to create outlines. That's not what I want. So just use my 1/2 inch, and I'm just going to touch here and there, just to clean up the top a little bit, but keep it rustic. Make sure that it looks distressed. For the top, I'm just going to suggest a little bit of the grain, and I think I want to do that just by tapping here and there, almost like stippling. Not a lot, so just like that, because the grain, the end grain on wood is pretty rough. But again, overall I want it to look white, so I don't want to fill this in too much. Oops, a little too much there. And if I decide, I think I might increase the contrast on that, but I'll do that later. So now I think we can start working on the details of the bird.
Okay.
So I took a couple of minutes here to redraw some of the birds so that it's easier to see, and then I'm just going to start finishing it up. So when we look at our references, we can see that the head itself has to be a little bit darker. Then we have a gray area here. Then you have these dark shadows that help separate the wings, and that's what we're going to start doing now. So I'm going to mix up more of that dark gray. So I'm going to take the burnt sienna and the ultramarine blue and get a really nice rich dark gray. And I'm going to actually shift over to my zero brush because there is some little detail work, and I'm going to roll it just like I always do. And when I start putting in these little details, I'm actually going to allow a little bit of that underpainting to show through. So I'm not just going to fill it in. And it's very short little strokes. Since the light's coming here, I'm going to allow just a little bit more of that gray to show up there. And then back here, I want to make sure that it's nice and dark. And that might mean that I may have to give it more than one coat. When I do this area around the eye's going to be dark, but then it's got this little white area and this little white area. So the first kit kind of helped me keep that area relatively clean, even though it wasn't perfect the shape that I wanted, but I can adjust that now that I'm working with the detail brush. So I'm just going to do a little bit of this because it's just actually pretty straightforward. And again, you may have to repeat some of this to make your shadows dark enough. So this stops right about here. And then I can see that the top of the beak has a shadow. It's not really a shadow, it's just a dark beak right here. But I'm going to leave the top a little bit brighter. I'll do the eye later. And then we have these area underneath here around the neck area, but we have to allow some of those white marks to show through. That'll be more of that orangey color, so we'll come back to that in a bit. Now I notice there's a shadow that separates this part of the wing from this part of the wing. So get in here, and I'm not just drawing, I'm actually just tapping to suggest shadow, but a kind of a texture shadow, I guess you could call it. And then there's another one on this side. And then we can see where the flight feathers begin, that there are shadows underneath those as well. Now these are much smoother, so in this case I am going to use just a lining technique. Now there's more shadows back here, and these flight feathers are much longer. Here, because some of the frisket got in there, I'm actually going to have to block it in and then come back and put in the shadows. Otherwise it's going to have too much white showing underneath it. But we got to be careful because there is some light areas here, which is why I had the frisket there. Okay, mix up a little more. And we got some long feathers right here. So a little bit of dry brushing just to suggest where those feathers are going to be. There's a little bit of the wing showing on that side. Then we have some gray and white here. So I'm going to put in some grays and leave pockets of whites. Now the legs, they have more of a brownish gray tone feel to them. So it's the same mixture but with a little bit of extra burnt sienna in it. So the gray is more to the brown side. And then there's a little bit of white showing that separates the legs from each other. So when I do this part here, I'm just going to leave a little slither right there, just to separate the little feet. You can see a little bit of the other one back there. And then the talons are dark, so a little bit more blue. And a little shadow there just to get more separation. And from here on out, it's mostly just fine tuning. So I got to darken in the eye. When I darken the eye, I want to go really dark. And I'm just going to leave a tiny little area right, like right there. And I'll come back to that, give it another coat. For the underbeak, take some of this sienna mixture that I did for the chest with a little bit of the yellow. And then tiny bit of orange. Too much there. There we go. Okay. The tail should be dry enough where I can go in and add the flight feathers, or the tail feathers. I'm going to create more of a shadow underneath this wing here. And then fade it underneath. There we go. Feel like here there needs to be a little bit more of a break between that and that. And then these here you can't see that well, so I'm going to add it some more. And from here on out it's just fine tuning really. So this area here needed to be reshaped because it was the wrong shape. And we need to put the shadow from the bird onto the fence. So all I need to do there Let's grab some of this purple mixture and the gray mixture that we had earlier. And since the light's coming this way, shadow here, too wet. Shadow here, and then more than likely it's going to come down this way. A little bit more gray, it's a little too purple. And then let's just let it disappear. Shadow there. And this here, I need to thicken that up just a little bit. It's not quite thick enough. So mix up some more of that color. And fill this little area in. And then just let it fade into the rest. Feel like there should be a little bit of shadow down here also. Cast shadow from the tail. And I think I am going to increase the contrast right here just a little bit, because especially on this one, it seems to me like it's blending in a little too much. So all I have to do there is turn this upside down. And then I'm going to use clean water. And I'm just going to wet this area wider than I need. So right here, this way, come in this way. And the reason that I'm wetting it first is because when I blend, I want it to fade. I don't want it to go into the fence. I want it to go opposite of the fence. So just here and there, just to create a little bit more contrast. Now you'll see why it's kind of important to wet that paper first. By having that paper wet a little bit, I did not have to rush when I was mixing colors. And I can blend these, because all I'm trying to do is create a little bit more separation between the fence and the background. That's it. So like there's a little bit of a hard line. It's a little bit too green. So grab some of this purple mixture, throw it in there, and then just fade it underneath the bird. And a little bit on the other side too, just to make it look unified. Then up here, just going to hit it with clean water, just to get rid of those brush strokes. Alright, let's see what we got. I think that'll just about do it. I could keep going, I can put little knots in the fence and all that, but for the purpose of this lesson, I think that is a good stopping point. So this would be, I would say, probably intermediate level. If you're a beginner, you can actually simplify it even more and keep the colors relatively loose and not worry too much about the detail. I hope you like this one. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll catch you on the next one.